My name's Tyler Whitman, and I wash dishes at a 24-hour dive off Highway 17 in Palatka, Florida. Population somewhere between nowhere and forgotten. 3 months ago, I was loading freight trucks in Jacksonville until my back gave out. Workers' comp ran dry, rent didn't, and suddenly, I was answering Craigslist ads for reliable overnight help, cash daily, no questions asked. The Moonlite Diner squats between a defunct Texaco and a cemetery that's been there since before Florida was a state. Locals call it the graveyard shift for obvious reasons. The owner, Betty Kowalski, hired me on the spot, said I had the right look for night work. Whatever that meant, I needed the money. Betty's been running this place since the Carter administration. Bleached hair stacked high, cigarette always burning, voice like gravel in a blender. She handed me a laminated card on my first night. "Rules," she said, tapping ash into a coffee cup. "Follow them. Don't ask why. Kids who ask questions don't last." I laughed it off. Rules for washing dishes? How hard could it be? The regulars started showing up around 11. Truckers heading north on I-95, insomniacs seeking pie and conversation, the occasional drunk stumbling in from Murphy's Tavern next door. Normal people living normal lives. During those early hours, the moonlight felt like any other greasy spoon. Burnt coffee, cigarette smoke, and that particular smell of industrial cleanser, mixed with decades of fryer grease. But after midnight, everything changes. After midnight, the diner goes soft and hollow. The neon hums. The coffee burns low, and the little radio by the dish pit plays a whisper of oldies. I was scraping plates when the song broke into a hard hiss, like bees in a jar. The volume climbed on its own. Through the static, a flat voice began to read numbers, slow and careful. 40, 108, eastbound, exit. Mile markers. Then it said my full name. Once. Again. I turned the dial. Nothing but snow. The clock over the grill said 112. I blinked, and it said 142. My stack of plates was finished and dry. My gloves were still dripping. The radio clicked back in, softer now, like a breath at my ear. Next, eastbound, St. John's. Look up. I looked toward the front windows. The lot was empty. But in the glass, I saw moving light. Headlights sliding past, dozens of them, like a highway was running right through our reflection. A wet line crept across the tile at my feet, gritty and dark, as if tires had just rolled by. The radio voice whispered one last thing, clear as a bell, a mile marker I knew from the drive-in. When I turned back to the sink, those same numbers were written in the fog on the stainless steel, drawn by a fingertip I couldn't see. That was my first night. Betty found me standing there, staring at those numbers, dish towel still in my hands. "Did you read the rules?" she asked. I nodded toward my apron pocket where the card waited. "Good, you'll need them." I pulled the laminated card from my apron pocket. The paper underneath was yellowed, typewriter font faded but readable. 7 rules, numbered in red ink. Moonlite Diner. Night protocols. After 1 a.m., if the radio plays your name, respond with "present for duty." Do not ask who's calling. When the coffee pot brews on its own, pour exactly 7 cups. Leave them on the counter. Do not drink from them. If customers arrive without car headlights in the lot, serve them normally. Their money is always exact change. The walk-in cooler stays locked from 2 to 4 a.m. If you hear scratching from inside, turn the radio volume to maximum. Any phone calls between midnight and dawn go straight to Betty. Wake her if necessary. Do not listen to the conversation. If the front door chimes and no one enters, prop it open for exactly 3 minutes. Count aloud. The grease trap under the sink will occasionally bubble. When this happens, run hot water until it stops. Never look down the drain. I read them twice. The first time I laughed. The second time, I folded the card back into my pocket. "Betty?" I called toward the office where she was doing paperwork. "These rules are..." "Real," she said without looking up. "Every single one. Last kid thought they were a joke, too. We found his car in the Everglades 3 weeks later, engine still running." The coffee pot gurgled behind me. I turned to check it. Still had half a pot from the evening shift. But when I looked back, 7 white ceramic mugs sat in a perfect line on the counter. Steam rose from each one. The pot was empty. My hands felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. I counted the mugs again. 7. The coffee inside was darker than what we'd been brewing all night, thick as motor oil. "Rule 2, Betty said from the doorway. "Don't overthink it, Tyler. Just follow the list." A car pulled into the lot, an old Buick with a bad muffler. Through the window, I watched an elderly man in a John Deere cap climb out, but the headlights never came on. The engine died with a wheeze. "Rule 3 coming up," Betty muttered. The man entered, his boots making no sound on the linoleum. He looked normal enough, weathered face, work clothes, the kind of guy who'd been farming citrus his whole life. But when he sat at the counter, I noticed his hands. They were clean. Too clean. Not a callus or dirt line anywhere. "Coffee," he said. "Black." I poured from our regular pot, the one I'd just brewed fresh. He wrapped both hands around the mug and smiled at me. His teeth were perfectly straight, perfectly white, like dentures fresh from the mold. "Mighty fine night," he said. "Sure is," I agreed, because what else do you say? He drank his coffee in one long pull, set down exact change, $2.47, and walked out. The Buick started up with that same wheeze, but I never heard it drive away. When I looked out the window, the lot was empty. The 7 cups on the counter were gone. In their place, 7 crumpled dollar bills sat in a neat row. "They always tip," Betty said, collecting the money. "Don't know why, but they do." I wanted to ask who they were, but remembered what happened to the last guy who asked questions. Instead, I went back to my dishes, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The hot water ran over my hands, steam fogging up my glasses, and for a moment everything felt ordinary again. That's when the phone rang. It was an old rotary model mounted on the wall beside the grill, the kind that belonged in a 1970s kitchen. Betty looked up from her paperwork, checked the clock, 1:47 a.m., and nodded at me. "Rule 5, she said. "Don't answer. Get me instead." The phone kept ringing as I walked to her office. 6 rings, 7, 8. Each ring seemed louder than the last, echoing off the empty diner walls like a church bell. Betty picked up on the 9th ring. "Moonlite Diner," she said. Then she listened. For a long time. Her face went pale, then flushed, then settled into something I couldn't read. "Tuesday," she finally said. "Same as always." She hung up and looked at me. "Tyler, you got family in town?" "No, ma'am. Just me." "Good. Keep it that way." She returned to her paperwork like nothing had happened. "And Tyler? Tomorrow night, bring a watch. You're going to need to keep better track of time." Hi, everyone. Before we move forward, I have something exciting to tell you. Many of you asked for stories without the strange rules, so I created a brand new channel just for that. It's called Mr. Grimm Archive. The link is in the description, or you can click the card above. I think you'll really enjoy it. So check it out whenever you want some more exciting types of stories. Also, I hope you're enjoying the 2 uploads a day. Let me know in the comments if you like some stories from your location. Now, let's continue with today's story. The next night, I brought my father's old Timex, the one he'd worn loading cargo ships in Jacksonville back when the port still mattered. Betty nodded approvingly when she saw it strapped to my wrist. Smart boy. Time gets slippery in here after dark. She wasn't kidding. By 11:30, I'd already learned to check my watch obsessively. The wall clock above the grill had a habit of jumping forward or crawling backward when I wasn't paying attention. The Timex kept steady rhythm against my pulse. The dinner crowd thinned out around midnight. A few truckers heading to Georgia. A nurse from the hospital grabbing coffee before her shift. Normal people doing normal things. I was starting to think maybe the previous night had been some kind of initiation prank. Then 1 a.m. rolled around, and the diner began its transformation. First, the air changed. It got thicker somehow, like breathing through wet cotton. The neon beer signs flickered in sequence. Budweiser, Miller, Coors, spelling out patterns I couldn't quite grasp. The radio crackled to life with that same oldies station. Patsy Cline singing about falling to pieces. I was elbow deep in Dishwasher when the music cut out. Tyler James Whitman, the flat voice said through the static. Tyler James Whitman. Betty looked up from her crossword puzzle, eyebrows raised expectantly. Present for duty, I managed, my voice cracking like a teenager's. The radio returned to Patsy Cline mid-verse, as if nothing had happened. But Betty smiled, actually smiled, for the first time since I'd met her. Good boy, you're learning. 20 minutes later, the coffee pot started its midnight ritual. This time I watched it happen. The machine clicked on by itself, water began flowing, and the familiar gurgling filled the silence. I counted as 7 clean mugs materialized on the counter, arranged in a perfect line. The coffee was different tonight. Not just dark, it seemed to absorb light, creating little pools of shadow around each mug. Steam rose in thin columns that twisted and bent against the air conditioning, forming shapes that almost looked like letters before dissolving. Don't stare too long, Betty warned. Makes some people sick. I forced myself to turn away, focusing on my dishes instead. But I could feel those 7 cups behind me like a weight between my shoulder blades. Around 2:15, I heard the scratching. It started soft, fingernails on wood maybe, or claws on metal, coming from the direction of the walk-in cooler. The sound grew louder, more frantic, like something trapped trying to claw its way out. My watch read 2:16. Rule 4 was in effect. Betty had vanished into the bathroom, leaving me alone with the scratching. It was getting violent now, metal against metal, accompanied by what sounded like muffled crying, or maybe laughing. Hard to tell. I cranked the radio volume to maximum. The oldies station exploded into static-soaked music, drowning out whatever was happening behind that locked cooler door. Hank Williams singing about being so lonesome he could cry, but his voice kept distorting, stretching like a record played at the wrong speed. The scratching stopped abruptly at 2:21. When Betty returned, she found me standing rigid by the radio, my knuckles white against the volume knob. How long? She asked. 5 minutes, maybe 6. Good. Last kid tried to investigate. Found him the next morning frozen solid in there, even though the cooler was running warm. She lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Medical examiner said hypothermia, but that boy was scared to death first. Could see it in his eyes. The front door chimed at 2:47. I looked toward the entrance, expecting to see a customer, but the doorway was empty. Just the night air drifting in, carrying the smell of swamp water and Spanish moss. Rule 6. Prop it open for exactly 3 minutes. count aloud. I wedged the door open with a rubber doorstop, then started counting. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. Betty watched me from behind the counter, her cigarette burning down to ash between her fingers. 47 Mississippi, 48 Mississippi. The air grew colder as I counted. Not winter cold. This was something else, like standing near a morgue freezer. My breath started fogging, and I could hear Betty's teeth chattering behind me. 100 Mississippi, 101 Mississippi. Something brushed past my shoulder at 150. Not wind. Wind doesn't have fingers. This touch was deliberate, curious, like someone testing the texture of my skin through my work shirt. 178 Mississippi, 179 Mississippi. A whisper in my ear, so close I could feel breath that wasn't there. Thank you. 180 Mississippi. I pulled the doorstop free and let the door swing shut. The warmth returned immediately, and my breath stopped fogging. Betty stubbed out her cigarette. What did it say? She asked. Thank you. That's new. She looked troubled. Usually they don't talk. The rest of the night passed quietly until 4:30, when I heard the bubbling. It came from under the dish sink, a wet, percolating sound like a coffee pot full of mud. The grease trap was acting up again, just like Rule 7 warned. I turned on the hot water full blast, letting it cascade down the drain. The bubbling grew more violent, and I caught a whiff of something rotten drifting up from the pipes, like meat left too long in summer heat. The smell got stronger. My eyes began watering, and I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. Whatever was down there didn't want to be washed away, but I followed the rule. Kept the hot water running, kept my eyes fixed on the faucet handle, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to look down into that drain. The bubbling stopped after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The smell faded, replaced by the industrial scent of drain cleaner and soap. Betty appeared beside me, studying my face. You looked, didn't you? No, ma'am. Kept my eyes up the whole time. She nodded, but something in her expression suggested she didn't quite believe me. And maybe she was right to doubt. Because even though I'd kept my eyes on that faucet handle, even though I'd followed Rule 7 to the letter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something down in those pipes had been looking back at me. Dawn broke over Highway 17 at 6:23, painting the eastern sky the color of weak coffee. The diner returned to normal, or what passed for normal in this place. The air lightened, the shadows retreated, and the first morning customers began trickling in. See you tonight, Betty said as I clocked out. But as I walked to my car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the gravel beside my Honda, pressed deep into the soft earth, was a handprint, too large to be human, with fingers that ended in points. It was still wet. I spent the day staring at that handprint. After getting home to my efficiency apartment above Palmetto Pond, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon, maybe my imagination running wild after a weird night. But raccoons don't leave prints that size, and my imagination wasn't creative enough to conjure 5-fingered hands with claws. By evening, I'd made a decision. I drove back to the Moonlite 2 hours early. Betty was in the parking lot, hosing down the gravel near my usual spot. The handprint was gone, washed away, but she looked up when my Honda pulled in. You're early, she said, coiling the hose. Couldn't sleep. Betty, there was something by my car this morning. I know. She lit a cigarette, hands steadier than they'd been the night before. Happens sometimes. Usually means they're getting comfortable with you. Betty studied me for a long moment, like she was deciding how much truth I could handle. "Walk with me." We headed toward the cemetery behind the diner. Up close, the headstones were older than I'd realized, some dating back to the 1800s, carved names worn smooth by Florida weather. Spanish moss draped the oak trees like funeral shrouds. "This place used to be a way station," Betty said, picking her way between the graves. "Back when Highway 17 was just a dirt road and folks traveled by horseback. Travelers would stop here for food and rest before crossing the St. Johns River." We stopped beside a cluster of unmarked graves, their stones too weathered to read. Problem was, not all the travelers made it across that river. Gators, mostly. Sometimes bandits. Sometimes they just disappeared. Families would come looking, find nothing, and assume the worst. A breeze stirred the Spanish moss above us, creating patterns of shadow and pale moonlight. "But the missing weren't always dead," Betty continued. "Some of them found their way back here, changed, hungry. The original owner, my great-grandfather, he made a deal with them. Feed them, serve them, give them what they needed, and they'd leave the living customers alone. The 7 coffee cups, among other things." She flicked ash onto an unmarked grave. "The rules aren't just safety protocols, Tyler. They're a contract. Break them, and the deal's off." Back inside, Betty showed me something I'd never noticed. A framed photograph hanging beside the time clock. Black and white, probably from the 1940s. It showed the diner's original incarnation. A simple lunch counter with a handwritten sign reading, "Palmetto Station." In the background, barely visible, stood 7 figures. Too distant to make out details, but something about their posture was wrong. They stood too straight, too still, like mannequins arranged by someone who'd never seen humans interact naturally. "Great-grandfather's original customers," Betty said. "They've been coming here ever since. Same 7, same routine. Coffee at 1 a.m., gone by sunrise." The dinner shift crawled by. Every time the front door opened, I found myself checking the customer's reflection in the windows, looking for headlights in the parking lot. Around 11:30, I started recognizing the signs of midnight's approach, the air thickening, the neon signs beginning their sequence, my own heartbeat growing louder in my ears. At 12:47, the radio crackled to life. But instead of calling my name, it began broadcasting something else. Highway traffic reports from the 1970s. Mile markers that no longer existed, referring to exits that had been demolished decades ago. The announcer's voice had a tinny, recorded quality, like it was being played back from an old reel-to-reel tape. "Eastbound I-95, heavy congestion near the St. Augustine exit. Multiple vehicle accident reported. Emergency crews responding." Betty looked up from her magazine. "That's not one of the rules." The broadcast continued, describing accidents, traffic jams, and road conditions from 40 years ago. I recognized some of the locations, places where strip malls and housing developments now stood, back when they were nothing but palmetto scrub and cattle pastures. Single vehicle accident, Highway 17 near Palatka. 1973 Plymouth Duster, driver unresponsive, license plate. And he rattled off a number I recognized from the photograph on my dresser at home. My father's first car, the one he'd bought fresh out of high school. "Turn it off," Betty said, but her voice sounded distant. I reached for the radio, but before I could touch it, the broadcast cut to static. Then silence. At 1:03, the coffee pot began its ritual. 7 mugs appeared on the counter, filled with that light-absorbing liquid. But tonight, something was different. The steam rising from each cup formed distinct shapes. Faces, I realized. Human faces, but distorted, like reflections in funhouse mirrors. One of them looked familiar. It was the face from the traffic report, the one who'd been driving that Plymouth Duster on a night in 1973 when everything went wrong. My father, but younger, the way he'd looked in his army photos. His mouth was moving in the steam, trying to form words I couldn't hear. "Don't watch too long," Betty warned, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. The face in the steam kept talking, kept trying to communicate something urgent. Other faces joined him. Accident victims, maybe, or people who'd disappeared along these roads over the decades. All of them trying to speak, all of them silent. A car pulled into the lot. Then another, and another. Through the front windows, I watched 7 vehicles park in perfect alignment. Old cars, a 70s Buick, a 60s Chevelle, a rusted-out pickup truck that looked like it hadn't run since the Carter administration. No headlights, no engine sounds. They simply appeared, as if they'd been there all along. The customers entered in single file. I'd served the clean-handed farmer before, but tonight he brought friends. A woman in a nurse's uniform from the 1980s, bloodstains across the front that looked fresh. A teenager in a Letterman jacket, his neck bent at an angle that made my stomach lurch. A businessman whose suit was soaked through, river water dripping onto our linoleum. They took their usual seats at the counter. 7 customers, 7 coffee cups waiting. "Evening," the farmer said, and the others nodded in unison. I poured regular coffee for them, hands shaking slightly. Up close, I could see details I'd missed before. The nurse's name tag read Linda Kowalski, Betty's maiden name, probably a relative. The teenager's jacket bore the logo of Palatka High School, class of 78. The businessman had algae in his hair. They drank their coffee in perfect synchronization, each taking exactly 3 sips before setting their cups down. Exact change appeared on the counter, $21.29 total. Always the same amount. But as they prepared to leave, the farmer looked directly at me. "Your daddy says hello," he said, his voice carrying the faint echo of that radio broadcast. "Says to tell you he's proud of how you turned out." The businessman nodded. "Also says to watch yourself on Highway 17, especially during rain." They filed out in the same order they'd entered, and their cars vanished as silently as they'd arrived. I stood frozen by the coffee pot, processing what had just happened. Betty appeared beside me, her face pale. "They don't usually talk to the staff," she said. "That's concerning." "What does it mean?" "Means they're taking a personal interest in you." She stubbed out her cigarette with more force than necessary. "Could be good. Could be very, very bad." The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The rules were still in effect, the routine still mattered, but now there was a new element, a personal connection I didn't understand. As dawn approached, I found myself thinking about my father, about that accident he'd never mentioned, about all the things we'd never talked about before his heart gave out last winter. Maybe some conversations were meant to happen in places like this, where the boundary between worlds grew thin, and the dead could buy coffee with pocket change from lives they'd never finished living. The 4th night started wrong. I arrived at 10:30 to find Betty's car missing from the lot. The spare key was under the rubber mat by the back door, along with a hastily scrawled note. "Emergency in Gainesville. Back tomorrow. Follow the rules. All of them." Working alone had never been part of the plan. Inside, everything looked normal. Coffee brewed, grill cleaned, radio silent on the oldies station. But the air felt different, charged like the moment before a thunderstorm hits. My father's Timex ticked loudly against my wrist, each second stretching longer than it should. The evening customers were restless. Jake Morrison, a regular trucker who hauled oranges from Lakeland to Savannah, kept glancing toward the windows. "Feels like something's coming," he said, nursing his third cup of coffee. "Animals know it too. Saw a whole herd of deer just standing by the road, staring at nothing." By 11:45, the diner was empty, except for me and that brewing sense of wrongness. Midnight arrived like a held breath released. The transformation was more violent tonight. The neon signs didn't flicker. They blazed, pulsing so bright they hurt to look at. The radio jumped to life with a burst of static so loud I thought the speakers might blow. And underneath it all, a sound I'd never heard before, a low thrumming that seemed to come from the building's bones. At 12:52, the radio called my name. Tyler James Whitman. Tyler James Whitman. "Present for duty," I said, but my voice came out hoarse. Instead of returning to music, the radio kept talking. "Phase 2 initiated. Contractor compliance required. Deviation from protocol will result in termination of agreement." That wasn't how it was supposed to work. I grabbed the rules card from my apron, hands shaking as I read it again. Nothing about Phase 2. Nothing about protocol deviation. But as I watched, new text began appearing at the bottom of the laminated card, writing itself in that same red ink. Addendum. Emergency Protocols 8. When working alone, double compliance is required. Each rule must be followed twice. 9. If the radio issues direct commands, obey immediately. Hesitation voids all protection. 10. Emergency customers may arrive before standard hours. Serve them. Do not question their timing. 3 new rules I'd never seen before. The coffee pot activated at 1:07, but instead of 7 mugs, 14 appeared on the counter. The liquid inside was different too. Not just dark, but moving, swirling like oil mixed with water. The steam formed shapes that hurt to look at, twisting geometries that made my eyes water. I backed away from the counter, but the radio crackled again. "Rule compliance initiated. Contractor will pour additional servings." 7 more mugs materialized. 21 total now, filling every inch of counter space. The coffee kept pouring itself, overflowing onto the floor in dark puddles that spread too far and reflected things that weren't in the room. Car headlights swept across the front windows, but it was only 1:15. The 7 customers never arrived before 1:30. Rule 10 was already in effect. The vehicles in the parking lot were different tonight. Not the familiar collection of vintage cars, but modern vehicles. A white panel van with no license plates, a black sedan with tinted windows, a pickup truck that looked like it had rolled off the lot yesterday, but was somehow covered in decades of road dust. The customers who entered weren't the usual 7. A man in mechanic's coveralls walked in first, motor oil still fresh on his hands. Behind him came a woman in scrubs, but not the vintage nurse's uniform I'd seen before. These were modern hospital scrubs, the kind with cheerful cartoon prints. A construction worker followed, hard hat still on his head, limestone dust coating his boots. They weren't dead, or at least they weren't long dead. "Coffee," the mechanic said, sliding onto a bar stool. His voice sounded normal, alive, but when he moved his head, I caught a glimpse of the back of his neck. Something had taken a bite out of it. A big bite. I poured coffee with hands that wouldn't stay steady. These weren't the contract customers, the 7 who'd been coming here for decades. These were something else. Something new. "You Tyler?" the woman in scrubs asked. Up close, I could see her hospital ID badge. Memorial Hospital, Jacksonville. The photo showed a smiling face, but the face looking at me now had eyes like empty windows. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. We've been looking for you." The construction worker laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Boss wants to meet you, says you got potential." "What, boss?" But before any of them could answer, the front door chimed. No one entered, but this time I didn't need to prop it open. The door swung wide on its own and stayed that way. Cold air poured in, carrying smells I couldn't identify. Wet earth, copper pennies, something sweet and rotten like fruit left in summer heat. "Count," the mechanic said. "Rule 6 still applies." I started counting, but the numbers felt wrong in my mouth. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. At 15 Mississippi, something walked through that open door. I say walked, but that's not accurate. It flowed like smoke given weight and purpose. Roughly human-shaped, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, arms too long, joints that bent in directions that human joints shouldn't bend. It settled into the booth by the window, the vinyl squeaking under weight I couldn't properly see. 97 Mississippi, 98 Mississippi. The radio began broadcasting again, but not oldies or traffic reports. It was playing a recording of a phone conversation. Last seen leaving the hospital around midnight. Vehicle found abandoned on Highway 17. No signs of struggle, but the driver's door was standing open. 3 different calls, 3 missing people, 3 new customers sitting at my counter. 179 Mississippi, 180 Mississippi. I closed the door. The cold retreated, but that flowing thing remained in the booth, studying me with attention that felt like being weighed and measured. The woman in scrubs slid exact change across the counter. "We'll be back tomorrow night, with more friends." "The contract's expanding," the construction worker added. "Lucky you." They left as abruptly as they'd arrived, but their coffee cups remained on the counter. When I went to clear them, the ceramic was still warm, but the coffee inside had turned to something that looked like blood. At 2:30, the walk-in cooler began its scratching routine, but tonight it sounded like dozens of claws instead of just one set. I cranked the radio volume, but the oldies station was gone. Instead, static filled with voices, hundreds of them, all talking at once, all saying my name. The scratching grew frantic. Something heavy slammed against the cooler door from inside, over and over, like a body throwing itself against the metal. The whole wall shook with each impact. My watch showed 2:47 when the phone rang. No Betty to wake up. Rule 5 said not to answer, but what if it was her calling to check on me? What if she was in trouble? The phone kept ringing, 10 times, 15, 20. I picked it up. "Moonlite Diner," I said. Silence. Then breathing. Then a voice I recognized. "Hello, son." My father. Clear as if he was standing right beside me. "Dad? You need to leave that place, Tyler. Tonight. Right now. They're not just expanding the contract. They're changing it. Making it permanent." The line crackled with static. In the background, I could hear other voices, urgent and frightened. "Dad, I can't just..." "Listen to me. The rules aren't protection anymore. They're recruitment tools. Every night you follow them, you become more like us, more tied to that place." The connection started breaking up. "Find the original contract," he said, voice fading. "Great-grandfather's papers. Betty hid them in..." The line went dead. I hung up the phone, mind racing. Betty had said not to listen to conversations, but she'd never said not to participate in them. Technical violation or loophole? In the parking lot, more cars were arriving. Not just 3 or 4, dozens of them, filling every space and spilling onto the grass beside the cemetery. All modern vehicles. All with that strange accumulation of dust and age despite looking new. Dawn was still hours away, and I was alone with a contract that was apparently rewriting itself around me. The first wave of new customers began filing through the door at 3:17. They came in groups of 3 and 4, filling every booth, every stool, every available seat. A teenager in a Palatka High football jersey, grass stains still fresh on his uniform. A middle-aged woman in a business suit, briefcase clutched in white-knuckled fingers. An elderly man in fishing gear, tackle box at his feet and lake water dripping from his clothes. All of them ordering coffee. All of them paying an exact change. All of them staring at me with eyes that reflected the diner's neon like pools of stagnant water. But these weren't the measured, ritualistic customers I'd grown accustomed to. These people fidgeted, whispered to each other, checked their watches with nervous energy. Whatever had happened to them, it was recent enough that they hadn't fully accepted their situation. I kept pouring coffee and trying to process what my father had said. Find the original contract, Betty's papers, hidden somewhere in the diner. Betty's office was the obvious place to start, but I couldn't abandon the customers. Rule 3 still applied, even with dozens of them, maybe especially with dozens of them. The football player raised his hand. "Excuse me, sir? When do we get to go home?" Several other customers turned to look at me expectantly. The woman with the briefcase nodded. "I have a meeting tomorrow morning. This has been educational, but I really need to get back to Jacksonville." "I don't know," I said, which was the truth. The elderly fisherman stood up, tackle box clattering. "Son, I've been sitting here for 2 hours. Coffee's cold, service is slow, and my wife's probably worried sick. Now I appreciate the hospitality, but..." He stepped toward the door, and every other customer in the diner turned to watch. The air grew thick again, that pre-storm feeling multiplied by 40 pairs of eyes. The fisherman reached for the door handle. His fingers passed through it like it was made of water. He tried again, more forcefully this time. Same result. His hand went right through the metal handle, through the glass, through the wooden door frame. "What the hell?" He spun around, tackle box forgotten on the floor. "What kind of place is this?" The woman in the business suit was trying her cell phone, pressing buttons with increasing desperation. No signal. There's no signal anywhere. I backed toward the coffee station, mind racing. These people didn't understand where they were. They thought they were still alive, still part of the normal world. But they were paying an exact change, their money always adding up right, just like the original 7 customers. The grease trap began bubbling. Rule 7, run hot water until it stops. Never look down the drain. But with 40 customers watching my every move, following the rule meant explaining why I was running water for no apparent reason. Not following it meant, what? What happened if I broke Rule 7? I turned on the hot water. The bubbling grew more violent, accompanied by that rotten meat smell. Several customers wrinkled their noses. The football player stood up and walked over. "Plumbing problems?" he asked. "Something like that." "I do maintenance work. Mind if I take a look?" Before I could stop him, he knelt beside the sink and peered down the drain. He screamed. Not a shout of surprise or pain. A full-throated scream of absolute terror that went on for 15 seconds before cutting off abruptly. When he stood up, his face had gone chalk white, and his eyes were wider than human eyes should be able to open. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't ever look down there. There's something that wants to come up." The bubbling stopped. The smell faded. but the football player kept staring at the drain like it might swallow the entire diner. "What did you see?" the woman with the briefcase asked. "Hands," he said. "Hundreds of hands, all trying to climb up through the pipes. I needed to find those papers. Now, I'll be right back," I announced to the room. "Coffee's self-serve if anyone needs refills." Betty's office was cramped and cluttered. Filing cabinets, boxes of receipts, a desk covered in crossword puzzles and cigarette ashes. I started with the obvious places: desk drawers, filing cabinets, the small safe behind her chair. Nothing. Then I remembered something from that first night. Betty had been doing paperwork when the 7 customers arrived. Not just any paperwork. She'd been copying something from an old document, writing carefully in the margins of what looked like a legal contract. I searched her desk again, more thoroughly this time. In the bottom drawer, underneath a stack of employee tax forms, I found it. A manila folder marked "Original Agreement, 1892, in Betty's handwriting. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a handwritten contract in faded ink, signed by someone named Ezekiel Kowalski and 7 other names I couldn't quite make out. The second was a typewritten translation from 1967, probably Betty's grandfather's work. The third was Betty's own notes, dated just 2 weeks ago. I spread them out on her desk and began reading. The original contract was simple. Ezekiel Kowalski agreed to provide sustenance and sanctuary to 7 displaced spirits in exchange for protection of his establishment and safe passage for living customers. The spirits would receive coffee and acknowledgement from midnight until dawn. In return, they would ensure no harm came to living customers and that the business would prosper. But Betty's notes revealed the truth. The contract was written in what lawyers call evergreen language. It could be renewed, modified, or expanded under certain circumstances. One of those circumstances was when the barrier between worlds grows thin due to accumulated spiritual residue. Another was when a suitable vessel demonstrates willing compliance with established protocols. A third was in times of great need when the displaced require additional sanctuary. I was the suitable vessel. The dozens of new customers were the displaced requiring additional sanctuary. And something was making the barrier between worlds grow thin. Betty's most recent note was underlined in red ink. Contract automatically renews and expands every 7 years. Next renewal, October 31st, 2023. Tyler shows promise but doesn't understand what he's agreeing to. Must find way to break cycle before renewal becomes permanent. Today was October 29th. I had 2 days. A commotion from the main dining room drew my attention. Through the office window, I could see the customers getting agitated. The businessman who'd been trying his cell phone was now pressing his face against the front windows, breath fogging the glass. Others were clustering around the door, taking turns trying to grasp the handle that wouldn't solidify for them. "Let us out!" someone shouted. "I want to go home." The flowing thing in the corner booth hadn't moved, but it was paying attention now, watching the growing panic with what felt like satisfaction. I folded the contract documents and stuffed them into my back pocket. As I headed back to the main room, the radio crackled to life. "Attention all displaced spirits. Contract expansion in progress. Voluntary compliance appreciated but not required. Resistant entities will be processed according to standard protocols." The football player looked at me with desperate eyes. "What does that mean? What are standard protocols?" Before I could answer, the walk-in cooler door swung open. The scratching hadn't been coming from inside the cooler. It had been coming from things trying to get out of the cooler. And now they had. 7 figures emerged from the freezer, moving with that familiar two-straight posture I'd seen in the old photograph. But these weren't the original 7 customers. These were previous dishwashers, previous night shift employees who'd gotten too comfortable with the rules and found themselves unable to leave. They wore aprons stained with grease and coffee, name tags that read Miguel, Deshawn, Ashley, Connor, Maria, Jin, and David. The most recent addition, David, was wearing a Moonlite Diner polo shirt that looked exactly like the one hanging in my locker. "Welcome to the permanent staff," David said, his voice carrying that same flat radio quality. "Don't worry. You get used to it after the first few decades." The new customers pressed against the windows, their panic reaching fever pitch. Some were crying. Others were beating against the glass with fists that created no sound. "The barrier's weakening," Miguel explained, approaching the coffee station. "More spirits means more processing power, but it also means more strain on the containment protocols. Eventually, something's got to give." "What gives?" I asked. Ashley smiled, revealing teeth stained the color of old coffee. "Reality. The whole structure collapses, and this place becomes a permanent gateway. Every car accident, every drowning, every unexplained disappearance in Florida funnels through here. And everyone who works here becomes part of the processing system," Connor added. "Welcome to quality assurance, Tyler." The radio began counting down. Contract renewal in 47 hours, 36 minutes. All stations prepare for permanent integration. Outside, more vehicles were arriving. Not just cars now, ambulances, hearses, a school bus with darkened windows. The parking lot had expanded somehow, stretching back toward the cemetery and beyond, accommodating what looked like hundreds of vehicles. "How do I stop it?" I asked. David laughed. "Stop it? Kid, you signed up for this the moment you said present for duty. You've been feeding the system, strengthening it, preparing it for expansion. Every rule you followed, every customer you served, every night you chose to come back, it all counts as voluntary compliance." The original 7 customers walked through the front door, passing through the glass like it wasn't there. The farmer, the nurse, the teenager, the businessman, and 3 others I'd never seen clearly before. They took their usual seats at the counter, but tonight, they weren't alone. Behind them came dozens more figures, all wearing clothes from different eras, all carrying the weight of unfinished lives. "The contract expires at dawn on Halloween," the farmer said, voice echoing strangely. "You can choose to let it renew automatically, making this permanent, or you can break it completely. What happens if I break it? Everyone goes free, living and dead alike. But the gateway closes forever, and this place returns to being just another roadside diner." "What's the catch?" The farmer's smile revealed those perfect teeth. "To break it, you have to take our place. 7 new guardians for 7 old ones. You'll need 6 volunteers." I looked at the 40-plus customers crowding the diner, all of them trapped, all of them desperate to go home. What if I can't find 6 volunteers? Then the contract renews automatically, and everyone here becomes permanent staff, forever. Dawn was still 3 hours away, and I had the most important decision of my life to make. I had to tell them the truth. The 43 customers, I'd counted them during a brief lull, deserved to know what they were dealing with. Some had been sitting in those booths for hours, still believing they'd be going home soon. Still trying their phones, checking their watches, making plans for tomorrow. "Listen up," I called out, raising my voice above the murmur of confused conversations. "I need everyone's attention." The room fell quiet. 43 pairs of eyes turned toward me, reflecting the neon beer signs in ways that made my stomach twist. "You're not going home," I said. "Not in the way you think. You're all dead." The silence stretched for maybe 5 seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. "That's ridiculous. I was just driving to Ocala. My husband's expecting me. Look, son, I don't know what kind of game. Quiet." The voice came from the corner booth where the flowing thing had been sitting. It stood now, revealing its true form, roughly 8 feet tall, composed of shadows that moved like liquid mercury. When it spoke, the neon signs dimmed and the radio static faded to nothing. "The dishwasher speaks truth. You are displaced, separated from your mortal forms through various means of termination. Vehicle collisions, drowning, cardiac events, mechanical failures." The woman in the business suit stood up shakily. No, I just left the office. I was driving to meet a client in Palm Coast." The shadow thing finished. "Interstate 95, mile marker 278. Semi-truck crossed the median at 11:47 p.m. Impact velocity approximately 75 miles per hour. Death was instantaneous." She sat back down heavily, briefcase falling from her lap. The football player was studying his jersey, noticing for the first time that the grass stains were mixed with something darker. "The game against Middleburg, 4th quarter. We were driving home when..." He touched his forehead, fingers coming away wet. Oh God, my mom doesn't even know yet." One by one, the memories were returning. The elderly fisherman remembered the heart attack that hit him while casting his line into Crescent Lake. The teenager in the Letterman jacket touched his neck where the steering wheel had broken it. The woman in scrubs recalled the fentanyl-laced cocaine that had stopped her heart in the hospital parking lot. "But this feels real," someone whispered. "The coffee tastes real." David, the most recent addition to the permanent staff, poured himself a cup from the regular pot. "Reality is flexible here. Has to be, or the processing system wouldn't work. You taste coffee because you expect to taste coffee. You feel solid because you remember being solid." "What happens now?" the businessman asked. I pulled out the contract documents. "There's a choice. Tomorrow night, Halloween, the contract renews automatically. If that happens, this place becomes a permanent gateway between worlds, and everyone here becomes part of the staff. Forever." Ashley from the permanent staff nodded. "It's not a bad existence. You stop feeling hungry, stop feeling tired. Time passes differently. Some years feel like minutes, some minutes feel like decades. But we can't leave," Miguel added. "Can't see our families, can't finish what we started. We just serve coffee and watch the living world through windows we can never touch." "There is another option," I continued. "The contract can be broken completely. Everyone goes free, living and dead. The gateway closes, and this place goes back to being the normal diner." "What's the cost?" the football player asked. Smart kid. 7 volunteers have to take the place of the original guardians. 7 people who choose to stay and maintain the barrier from this side. The room erupted again, but this time the voices were angry, desperate. "Why should we volunteer? I didn't ask for this. Find somebody else. My children need me." I understood their fear. I'd have reacted the same way. But understanding didn't solve the problem. Connor stepped forward. "There's a third option nobody's mentioned." The shadow thing in the corner shifted, suddenly interested. "What kind of option?" I asked. "Let the system collapse completely. Don't renew the contract. Don't find volunteers. Just walk away and let it all come apart." "What would happen?" David's expression darkened. "Every displaced spirit in Florida gets pulled through the gateway at once. Thousands of them. maybe tens of thousands. They'll be looking for bodies to inhabit, lives to resume. The living world would become complicated. The woman with the briefcase stood up again. How long do we have to decide? I checked my father's Timex. 18 hours. I need to think. She walked toward the window, pressing her palm against the glass. For a moment, her hand became solid enough to leave a print on the surface. I have children too. A daughter starting college, a son in high school. If I volunteer, do they get to know what happened to me? No, Ashley said gently. That's part of the barrier. The living world forgets you existed. It's a kindness, really. Prevents them from trying to follow you here. A new voice spoke from the entrance. What the hell is going on in my diner? Betty stood in the doorway, taking in the crowded room with wide eyes. She looked older than when I'd last seen her, like the trip to Gainesville had aged her years in a single day. Emergency expansion, the shadow thing replied. Contract renewal approaching. We require additional processing capacity. Betty lit a cigarette with shaking hands. I told you to hold off until after Halloween. We're not ready for this kind of volume. The barrier weakness accelerated our timeline. Adaptation was necessary. She noticed the contract papers in my hand. Tyler, what are you doing with those? Learning the truth. You were going to let me sign up for this without knowing what it meant. I was trying to protect you, and them. She gestured toward the crowd of confused spirits. The system works when it's controlled, when it's managed properly. But if it collapses, I know. Connor explained the third option. Betty's cigarette fell from her lips. You can't be considering that. Why not? Maybe it's time for this place to close down. The permanent staff exchanged worried glances. Miguel spoke first. Tyler, you don't understand what you're suggesting. We've seen what happens when displaced spirits enter the living world without proper channeling. Remember Hurricane Andrew? The Pulse nightclub shooting? Most random tragedies aren't random at all. They're caused by spirits trying to force their way back into life, Jin added. Spirits who died violently, suddenly, with unfinished business. They possess the living, influence decision-making, create chaos trying to complete what they couldn't finish. The elderly fisherman looked up from his tackle box. So we're stuck here to protect the living world? That's one way to look at it, Betty said. Or you could see it as serving a purpose. Every spirit that finds peace here is one that won't cause havoc out there. A new commotion started near the back booths. Several customers were pointing toward the windows that faced the cemetery. Outside, the graves were opening. Not violently, not dramatically. Just opening, like doors being politely held ajar. And from each open grave, figures were emerging. Some wore burial clothes from decades past. Others were dressed in the outfits they died in. Work clothes, party dresses, hospital gowns. They walked across the parking lot in orderly lines, dozens of them, all heading for the diner's entrance. The Halloween surge, Betty whispered. It's starting early. The radio crackled. All stations prepare for maximum capacity processing. Contract renewal in 15 hours, 42 minutes. More spirits entered through the walls, the windows, the floor itself. The diner was expanding somehow, adding booths and tables and counter space to accommodate the growing crowd. But it wasn't expanding fast enough. Bodies pressed together, overlapping, occupying the same physical space in ways that hurt to look at. This is insane, the woman in scrubs said. How many spirits are there? Betty stubbed out her cigarette. In Florida? Thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. Every car accident on I-95, every drowning in the Gulf, every murder in Miami, every overdose in Jacksonville. They all pass through here eventually. The temperature in the diner was dropping. My breath began fogging, and frost was forming on the windows despite the October heat outside. The crowd of spirits generated no warmth, only the cold absence of life. "We have to choose now," I said, raising my voice above the growing murmur of hundreds of conversations. "The system can't handle this volume. It's going to collapse whether we want it to or not." Betty grabbed my arm. "Tyler, there's something else. Something I didn't tell you about the volunteer option." "What?" "The 7 guardians don't just maintain the barrier. They feed it. Every year they get weaker, more transparent, until eventually they fade away completely. The current 7 have been here since 1967. They're barely holding on." I looked at the farmer and his companions sitting calmly at their counter stools while chaos swirled around them. Up close, I could see through them now. They were fading, becoming translucent. "How long do the volunteers last?" "Depends on the volume they have to process. At current levels, maybe 50 years. With this expansion," she shook her head, "maybe 20. The radio began broadcasting an evacuation warning for the entire state of Florida, something about a massive storm system moving in from the Gulf. But I knew better. It wasn't a storm approaching. It was Halloween night, and the barrier between worlds was about to shatter completely. At 11:47 p.m. on October 31st, the Moonlite Diner held 847 souls. I'd stopped counting around 400, but the radio kept announcing arrivals like a twisted airport terminal. Every few minutes. Processing newcomer 485, vehicle collision, Highway 19 northbound. Processing newcomer 612, cardiac event, Shands Hospital parking garage. Processing newcomer 738, drowning incident, Crescent Beach. The diner had expanded beyond recognition. What started as a simple roadside establishment now stretched impossibly far in all directions, filled with booths, tables, and counter space that shouldn't have fit in the original building. The laws of physics had given up entirely. Betty chain-smoked by the register, her face drawn tight with exhaustion. The permanent staff moved through the crowd like ghosts among ghosts, pouring coffee that materialized from empty pots, clearing tables that refilled themselves instantly. 13 minutes, Betty announced, checking the clock that now read different times depending on where you stood. 13 minutes until automatic renewal. I'd spent the day talking to the original 43 customers, the ones who'd been here long enough to understand their situation. Most were terrified of volunteering. The football player, Marcus, had broken down crying when he realized his mother would never know what happened to him. The woman in the business suit, Sandra, kept talking about her children's college tuition and who would pay it now. But 6 people had stepped forward. Tommy Reeves, the elderly fisherman, had been the first. "I lived my life," he'd said. 83 years, good marriage, saw my grandkids graduate. If I can help these younger folks get free, that's worth something. Linda Watts, the woman in scrubs, had volunteered next. "I was killing myself with drugs anyway," she'd admitted. "At least this way, my death serves a purpose." 4 others had joined them. A retired teacher named Margaret, a mechanic named Carlos, a young mother named Jennifer who died in a car wreck on her way to pick up her kids, and a Vietnam veteran named Frank who said he'd been looking for a way to serve again. 6 volunteers. I needed 7. The shadow thing had been watching me all day, waiting. Now it approached, its form more solid than before, drawing substance from the gathered crowd. "Decision time approaches," it said. "7 guardians required. 6 have volunteered. You must choose the 7th, or choose automatic renewal." "What if I volunteer myself?" "Acceptable. Your willingness demonstrated commitment to the contract. You would serve well." I looked around the expanded diner at the hundreds of confused, frightened spirits. People who died suddenly, violently, without warning. They deserved better than eternal servitude in a roadside coffee shop. But I also thought about what Miguel had said. The chaos that would follow if all these spirits flooded back into the living world. Hurricane Andrew. Random tragedies that weren't random at all. "Tyler," Betty called from behind the register. "There's something else you need to know." She pulled out a manila folder I hadn't seen before. This one marked Addendum, 1967. When my grandfather took over from his father, he made a modification to the contract, a fail-safe clause. I took the document. The writing was in the same careful handwriting as the original, but with different ink. In the event that sufficient volunteers cannot be obtained for contract renewal, the current guardians may choose to extend their service for 1 additional cycle, provided they accept complete dissolution as payment. What does that mean? The farmer looked up from his coffee cup. His form was so translucent now, I could see through him to the wall behind. It means we can hold the barrier for another 7 years, but at the end of those 7 years, we don't just fade away. We cease to exist completely. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because we hoped you'd find 7 volunteers, the nurse in vintage scrubs replied. Her voice was barely audible. Complete dissolution is final. No afterlife, no peace, no continuation of any kind. Just nothing. The businessman nodded. But it would give you time to find a better solution. 7 years to figure out how to break the cycle permanently. Or 7 years to convince enough people to volunteer, the teenager added. 8 minutes until midnight. The crowd of spirits was growing restless. Some were crying, others were arguing, a few were trying to force their way toward the exits that wouldn't open for them. The diner's supernatural expansion was struggling to keep up with new arrivals. Contract renewal in 7 minutes, 38 seconds, the radio announced. Stand by for automatic processing. I made my decision. I'll be the 7th volunteer, I said. Betty dropped her cigarette. Tyler, no. You're 24 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. What life? Loading trucks until my back gives out completely? Living in an efficiency apartment above a pawn shop? This is the first place I've ever worked where I felt like I was doing something that mattered. The 6 volunteers looked at me with expressions ranging from gratitude to sorrow. Tommy Reeves nodded approvingly. Takes courage to volunteer when you've got the most to lose. Wait. The voice came from Marcus, the football player. He stood up, his Letterman jacket hanging loose on his teenage frame. I want to change my mind. Marcus, no, listen. I was 17. I had maybe 60 years of life left. You're older, you've got experience, skills. If someone needs to volunteer, it should be someone who's already lived most of their life. That's not how it works, Sandra interjected. We can't trade places once the choice is made. But Marcus was looking at the shadow thing. Can we? Can I take his place? The shadow thing considered this. The contract requires willing volunteers. If you withdraw your previous reluctance and volunteer freely, the substitution is acceptable. Marcus, you don't have to do this, I said. Yeah, I do. My mom, she'll grieve, but she'll move on. She's strong, but she raised me to help people when I could. He looked around the crowded diner. "This is the biggest help I'll ever be able to give. 3 minutes until automatic renewal." The original 7 guardians were barely visible now, their forms wavering like heat mirages. The farmer raised his translucent hand. "We need to vote," he said. "Accept the volunteers and renew the contract with new guardians, or choose complete dissolution and give you 7 more years to find a better answer." "What happens to everyone here if you choose dissolution?" I asked. "They get 7 years of processing," the nurse explained. "Normal operations, normal rules. They can find peace gradually instead of all at once. But at the end of those 7 years, if no solution is found, the barrier collapses anyway." 2 minutes? 15 seconds. I looked at Marcus, standing straighter than he had since realizing he was dead, at the 6 other volunteers, each carrying their own reasons for choosing to serve, at Betty, whose family had maintained this place for over a century, at the hundreds of spirits who just wanted to go home. "Vote," I said. "All 7 guardians vote. Majority decides." The farmer spoke first. "Dissolution. Give the boy 7 years to find a real solution." The nurse, "Dissolution." The businessman, "Dissolution." The teenager, "New guardians." These people deserve freedom now, not in 7 years. The remaining 3 guardians voted for dissolution. 4-3, the shadow thing announced. Contract extended under dissolution clause. Current guardians will maintain barrier for 7 additional years. 30 seconds to midnight. The 7 guardians stood up from their counter stools one final time. As they did, they became more solid, more visible, drawing power from somewhere deep in the earth beneath the diner. "Tyler," the farmer said, his voice strong and clear for the first time since I'd met him. 7 years. Find a way to free them all without this place. Find a way to let the dead rest and the living live without the barrier. How? That's for you to figure out. The clock struck midnight. The lights went out for exactly 3 seconds. When they returned, the original 7 guardians were gone. The diner had shrunk back to its normal size. The 800-plus spirits had vanished, sent to whatever processing center existed beyond the physical world. Only the original 43 customers remained, looking around in confusion at the suddenly empty space. And the radio was playing oldies again, soft and low, like nothing had ever been wrong. 7 years, Betty said quietly. God help us all. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 7 years after Halloween night at the Moonlite Diner. I was sitting in my office at the University of Florida's Paranormal Research Institute, a department that hadn't existed until I'd convinced the dean that studying unusual death patterns could prevent future tragedies. The letter was handwritten on diner stationery, Betty's careful cursive spelling out words I'd been dreading. Tyler, it's starting again. The coffee pot brewed by itself last night. 7 cups. Empty parking lot, but I can see headlights in the windows. The radio's picking up those old traffic reports. You have until Halloween to keep your promise. Minus B, I'd spent 7 years preparing for this moment. The first year, I'd focused on research, traveling to similar sites across the country. Turns out, the Moonlight wasn't unique. Every state had its version. Truck stops that served coffee to drivers who'd never arrived at their destinations. Diners where the night shift dealt with customers who paid in coins from the year they died. Bridges where travelers stopped to ask directions to places that no longer existed. The second year, I'd started documenting patterns. Newspaper archives, police reports, missing persons cases. For every major highway accident, there was usually a corresponding minor incident at a nearby way station. The spirits weren't randomly appearing. They were being guided, channeled, processed through established networks. By the third year, I'd identified the source. Construction. Every major road project, every highway expansion, every new interchange disturbed burial grounds, ancient pathways, sites where people had died violently. The displaced spirits needed somewhere to go, and places like the Moonlight had evolved to handle the overflow. The fourth year brought the breakthrough. Working with a professor of Native American studies, I'd learned about traditional burial practices, about how certain locations were meant to help spirits transition peacefully to whatever came next. The way stations weren't prisons, they were healing centers that had been corrupted by bureaucracy and fear. Years 5 and 6 were spent building alliances. I'd found others like me, people who worked at similar locations, who understood the rules and the costs. A trucker named Rosa, who managed a rest stop in Arizona. A ferry operator in Louisiana, who transported passengers across more than just rivers. A lighthouse keeper in Maine, whose beacon guided ships that had sunk decades ago. We called ourselves the Network. Now, approaching the anniversary of my father's warning, I had a plan. Instead of maintaining barriers, we would create pathways. Proper pathways based on traditional practices that would let spirits complete their transitions without getting trapped in endless cycles of servitude. The coffee shops and diners and rest stops would become what they were meant to be, temporary shelters, not permanent prisons. I packed my research notes, said goodbye to my graduate students who thought I was taking a sabbatical, and drove back to Palatka. The Moonlight looked exactly the same, down to the faded neon in the cemetery backdrop. But when I walked inside, I could feel the difference. The air was thick again, charged with pending transformation. Betty looked older, grayer, more worn down by years of managing something she'd never fully understood. The permanent staff were still there, Miguel, Ashley, Connor, and the rest, waiting tables that barely needed service, pouring coffee for customers who rarely came. "You ready for this?" Betty asked, lighting her first cigarette of what would probably be a very long night. I pulled out my father's Timex, still ticking steadily after all these years. 11:53 p.m. 7 minutes until the anniversary of our deal. "Yeah," I said, "I'm ready." The radio crackled to life, playing that familiar oldie station. But tonight, instead of waiting for it to call my name, I was going to do the talking. Tonight, I was going to break the cycle for good.